Welcome, everybody, to the Cover 2 podcast. This is going to be our NFL draft review. We are going to pick 6 teams, 2 positives each and 2 negatives as far as how their drafts went. To start the podcast, though, I'm Nick Nenad.
I'm Jared Smith.
Yes, and we actually have content once again. We've had content the last couple weeks with the NFL draft. The NFL draft was the highest rated NFL draft it ever was. Makes sense because everybody's sitting at home, and now we hope that our NFL review or NFL draft review is also highly rated here. So, Jared, your thoughts on the NFL draft overall just before we start reviewing teams?
I mean, listen, like the fact that they're blowing up, this was the highest rated NFL draft ever. Like, yeah, like you said, of course it is. Everyone's at home with nothing to do. There's no live sports, and this is the closest thing that we've had to any type of sport in the last 30 days. So of course people are going to watch. I mean, it's a good thing, but like to blow it up like, oh, it's the biggest, ratings show ever. Come on, man. I mean, there's a real reason why. I'm actually just happy that Vegas in, I believe, was it 2022? They're going to get a chance to host the draft again. Because obviously they couldn't this year. So
good for them.
Happy about that. And it's Vegas, so who knows? Maybe we do a show there. Maybe we end up going to Vegas for that.
That's true.
But as far as the draft went, obviously I was really excited. It's it's always intriguing. Like you hear from all the quote unquote experts about their analysis and all of their draft prep and what teams are going to do, and then the draft comes. And all of that, just goes down the tube, right? You see the Packers drafting a quarterback in the first round, and all the other, people or players sliding that you thought would go in the top 10 that end up going in the 20s and vice versa. So you never really know how it's going to play out. And I think that's the best part of the draft is the unknown.
Yeah. And this year, obviously, way more unknown because of the fact that there wasn't in-person meetings with most of these guys, especially some of these top picks. We really didn't know what was going to go down. We had a report before the draft that nobody really knew anything. That was proved to be somewhat untrue. The draft relatively went pretty clean and expected for the top 10, I would say. So I don't know where Rappaport was getting his information. I don't want to sit here and crap on Ian Rappaport, but it was a little disappointing. There wasn't a lot of trades in the top picks. But overall, I didn't really see a difference in this draft that I normally do. I guess you had the lack of crowd. It was still as entertaining. And it was our first kind of sports that we had, even though it really isn't sports. It was our first kind of sporting event since this has all gone down. I was super happy about it. That may have been because I had a few drinks during the draft, of course.
Well, duh. What are you supposed to sit there and just sip on water all night?
No,
I don't think so.
No, but it was funny. And one of the funny things is if you're wondering why we're doing this draft Wednesday or Thursday, hey, it's because we need a couple of days to recover after the draft. I mean, we go pretty hard. I know Jared and I and Alex Silva, who was on the last 2 podcasts, we all went pretty hard for draft day and potentially even draft day 2 for some of us. So
just a little bit.
Just a little bit, yeah. I don't remember the last 3 picks, so I had to research them. No, I'm just kidding.
I didn't go that hard, but okay. All right, Nick. Good for you, man.
Well, Cardinals got Isaiah Simmons, so
I was gonna say there's a reason why I think you were so excited and why you decided to go so hard because Isaiah Simmons, who was slotted to go pick 3 or 4, ended up falling to you guys at 7? Where'd you guys have 8?
Number eight.
Right. Yeah. So no, there's a reason why you guys were so excited. I understand. I get it.
Yeah, Panthers missed out. They had a great chance to pick him, and they decided to go with Derek Brown. We're not talking about those teams, which is why we're talking about them today. Today, we will actually be talking about these teams, the Minnesota Vikings, the Baltimore Ravens, the Las Vegas Raiders. I almost said Oakland right there, as well as the Green Bay Packers, Jacksonville Jaguars, and there was one more team we were going to talk about as well.
The nasty Philadelphia Eagles.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so those are the 6 teams we will be talking about today. If we have extra time at the end, we will add 2 more in there. But these are the teams we're gonna talk about, and we want to start with the defending. Actually, one of the best teams in the AFC, the Baltimore Ravens. Jared,
I was gonna say they're not defending anything right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say defending like AFC champ. For some reason, I don't know where my mind is at. Too little of sports going on. So the way we're going to do this too is each of us is going to kind of just give our opinion on why we think this is a great draft, and then the other person will just kind of comment on it. We're not going to go back and forth. It's going to be probably taking turns here, giving each other's opinions. So, Jared, you thought the Ravens had a great draft. Explain why.
Yeah, I gave them an A. And listen, for a team that didn't have a lot of holes to begin with, you get to go into the draft with just picking best player available, right? And even though you're in the back half of the draft for the majority of it, or at least for the first round, you can just sit and let the board fall and let the players come to you. And lo and behold, they find their middle linebacker in Patrick Queen, who was arguably could have gone in the top 15, right? He's that good. He's a sideline to sideline player, freakishly athletic, and who Lamar Jackson has already called Ray Lewis Jr., right? Because now maybe he's not the thumper that Ray Lewis was, but just the fact of being the defensive kind of captain, the guy that gets everyone lined up correctly. He will take over for C.J. Mosley, who was previously the Ravens' probably most known middle linebacker before he left for the Jets. But the fact that they get Patrick Queen, who slides to them at the end of the first round, and then in the second round, they get J.K. Dobbins, the running back out of Ohio State, who the last 2 years has rushed for over 2,000 yards per season, right? The dude is an animal. I think he's only like 5'9" or 5'10", so he's short, but he's super stocky. He catches the ball out of the backfield. He's just going to be another weapon for Lamar Jackson and for the Ravens offense. And you pair him with Mark Ingram, a kind of a 1-2 punch right there. And this Baltimore Ravens offense I don't know how you stop them, right? If Lamar Jackson even becomes an even better passer, at least from an accurate standpoint, which I believe he will, then this offense will become even more scary. And then in the third round, they get Justin Matabuke, the defensive tackle from Texas A&M. Now, maybe he wasn't the best defensive tackle in this draft, but only because of some off the field / personal issues did he slide. I mean, this guy is a potential first round pick just as far as an athlete goes. And so they get him to pair with Calais Campbell and Derek Wolfe, two other defensive linemen that they brought over. I mean, like I said, they're just a bag of riches, right? This team just kind of added on to what they already have. They didn't really lose much from last year. And right now on paper, this Ravens team, I think they're not only playoff bound, but I think it's very possible and reasonable to slot them in as a potential Super Bowl contender coming out of the AFC, other than Kansas City, of course. But I mean, nothing really bad to say about this team's draft so far.
Yeah, no, Jared, they were in my top 5 as far as drafts go as well. And I think the only thing that shied me away from having them near the very top, the top 3, top 2, was the fact that they already did have Mark Ingram at running back, and so they didn't necessarily need J.K. Dobbins. Yes, they become more dangerous, but they did need an edge rusher, and they didn't end up picking an edge rusher at all.
Well, I will say this though, and I totally get what you're saying, yeah. And I think that Mark Ingram can be that featured guy who's on the field, in every down back. But if you really look at it, when Mark Ingram was in New Orleans, he was paired with Alvin Kamara. Now, J.K. Dobbins is a different back from Alvin Kamara, but I think Mark Ingram thrives better when he has a companion, right? When he doesn't necessarily have to carry the entire load. He can stay fresh during a game, and instead of having 25 to 35 carries, he's got around maybe 14 to 15, right? And then you bring in J.K. Dobbins, and they just split carries. I think that will suit the Ravens offense a little better and suit Mark Ingram a little better. So I get what you're saying, but I like that 1-2 punch a little more.
Yeah, and I don't want to harp on any negatives with this team. I mean, they drafted 2 offensive linemen in the 3rd and 4th rounds. A lot of people don't look into the 3rd and 4th rounds. I consider those rounds, almost just as good as like the 2nd round, for example. You find a lot of players in the middle of that draft. They draft another linebacker, Malik Harrison from Ohio State in the 3rd round. He dropped to them as well. Devin DuVernay, the Texas wide receiver. Somehow they got more offense in the 3rd round. So, yeah. This team had a really good draft. Oh, yeah, and they also have Lamar Jackson. So, it's, they covered pretty much all of their bases. Like I said, they need an edge rusher, but they also draft 2 linebackers. So you kind of slot that in as well. So really nothing wrong with this draft. I was just a little gun shy on saying they had the best, for example, just because of the J.K. Dobbins pick. All right. So moving to this was my number one draft, and I did a weird analysis on this. I kind of looked at what these teams needed, their top 5 needs before the draft, and I looked back and I went to go see, oh, did they cover these needs? I gave more credit for the top 4 picks than I did the 5 through 7 picks. And so that's how I ended up doing it. And the Vikings by far were my best draft just based on this. They needed a corner, wide receiver, edge rusher, and offensive lineman, and they drafted all of those in the first 4 rounds. They ended up with, let me count this, 15 picks total in the draft, and they almost got every single thing they needed.
Good Lord.
They needed a safety, and they drafted 2 safeties in the later rounds as well. Obviously, somehow Justin Jefferson fell to them. Jeff Gladney fell to them. Those were their top 2 needs, and they got him in the first 2 rounds.
There's a reason Justin Jefferson fell to them, but I'll wait and get into that a little bit later.
Oh, yeah. Well, we definitely will. I cannot wait to discuss that team's draft. But yeah, so if you actually look at their top 3 needs were corner, wide receiver, and an offensive lineman. Those were their first 4 picks. 2 corners, a tackle, Ezra Cleveland from Boise State, and Justin Jefferson, who I think shouldn't have even gone to them. And then you look at their next need, edge rusher. They drafted 2 edge rushers in the 4th round. Like, it literally is one of the most perfect drafts you could come up with. And they drafted every single one of their needs eventually in this draft. So that's why I had them number 1. They somehow got Troy Dye in the 4th round as well. That was a pick, I think, just a luxury pick that they shouldn't have gotten. Troy Dye was looking at possibly going in the 2nd or 3rd round. He fell to them as well. So yeah, I just thought, they drafted all of their needs, and they drafted their top needs with their top picks, which is why I gave them the most credit. And I think they're going to be a pretty good team next year after this draft. Hopefully these guys work out for them.
Yeah, listen, I'm all about teams drafting for need, and I said this during the draft show, the last 2 shows that we've done, that in the first round and sometimes even in the second round, depending on if a guy slides to you, I feel that it's best to draft best player available. And I'll bring up an example. I'll talk about the Cardinals, your team, Nick, right? Yep. It was every mock draft that I had seen for the last 2 months had the Cardinals taking an offensive lineman to protect Kyler Murray because he was sacked 48 times last year, like the most sacked quarterback in the league, running for his life. And what do the Cardinals do? They pick Isaiah Simmons because he fell to them. Now, obviously, I think they did the right move and not drafting need, right? Because you let Isaiah Simmons go, I think that's only hurting your team when there's depth at that tackle spot and you can end up getting a tackle with your 2nd pick. Same thing with the Cowboys, my team, right? They don't need another top wide receiver. You have Amari Cooper, you have Michael Gallup.
Yeah.
But CeeDee Lamb falls in their lap. You don't let players like that go. So in my opinion, when teams can kind of stick to best player available and not just jump for a need, I feel that in the long run, they're actually doing their team a better service. So the Vikings, listen, when you have 15 picks, it's tough to screw up. Actually, you know what? It can kind of go both ways because you can maybe get a little greedy and be like, oh, we have 15 picks. We can get this guy next round. But I think the Vikings, you're right. Justin Jefferson fell to them, which he never should have. Jeff Gladney is somewhat of an underrated corner. Some reporters had him late 1st round. Others had him in the 2nd. We do know that their head coach, Mike Zimmer, he's big on secondary. That was kind of where he came up and made a name for himself as a coach in the NFL. So he knows how to get his secondary players going. They also got Cameron Dantzler, another cornerback from Mississippi State, I believe in the 3rd round, in the late 3rd round as well. So they needed to replace their secondary after 3 starters left in free agency last year. I like what the Vikings did, but like I said, when you've got 15 picks, you better do something right? Because if you screw up, you have a bad draft with 15 picks, there should be general managers fired, scouts fired, and more people fired, right? So they had a really good pick, and 15, that should be like a record for draft picks in 1 year.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is I believe they traded up to get Jeff Gladney, right? Because Jeff Gladney, that should have been the 49ers pick at 31. I'm forgetting the intricacies of the draft, but I believe they actually traded up for Jeff Gladney as well, right? Or did they trade back? They
traded back into the first round with San Francisco, and they picked Jeff Gladney at 31.
They traded. What did they trade away? What was it? Was it the 25th pick, right? And switched. Because I think the 49ers ended up getting Brandon Ayuk, the 25th pick.
Yes, they did.
Yeah. Okay. So they trade up there, which I didn't look at all the trades here, so I'm not really talking about that necessarily. But yeah, interesting. They trade up for Jeff Gladney too. But yeah, so it was almost impossible for me to say they didn't have a good draft. I didn't penalize them for having too many picks. Yeah. I just look at this and they got all of their needs in this draft, and hopefully most of these needs they end up panning out for them. Just enough to where they play the Cowboys and Cardinals, and then they lose, of course.
But that's, you don't even have to say that. Come on, man.
Absolutely. So Jared, your next team is going to be the Jaguars. I didn't have them in my top 6. They actually fell below. So I'm actually interested to see here why you thought the Jaguars had one of the best drafts.
And you know what? I never really in a million years would have thought that I would be saying this about the Jaguars after the offseason that they've had. And it's just the Jaguars. They're kind of like the Browns, where if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. Yeah. We've seen them basically trade away their entire defense. Last year, they traded away Jalen Ramsey. They eventually traded away A.J. Bouye. So 2 of their starting corners are gone. They traded away Calais Campbell, one of the best defensive tackles in the league. They have a disgruntled running back. And I'm sorry, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name.
Leonard Fournette.
They have a disgruntled running back in Leonard Fournette. They have a disgruntled defensive end in Yannick Ngakoue right now, right? So I don't know what it is about Jacksonville. I don't know if it's the water down there. I don't know if it's the facilities. But for some reason, players just don't seem to like playing in Jacksonville. And maybe it's because they just don't win. Well, unfortunately, for the draft picks that just got drafted, they are going to have to be tasked with changing that culture down there. But the fact that the Jaguars had 2 first-round picks, their first pick was corner C.J. Henderson, who, maybe he's not better than Jeff Okudah, who was the first cornerback that came off the board in this year's draft. But C.J. Henderson, I feel like he was literally flying up draft boards. Like, I was not surprised at all that he ended up going top 10. I think it was easily the second best corner. And like I said, after losing Jalen Ramsey and A.J. Bouye, you have to bring in a top flight corner to replace those guys. Then they get Cleveon Chason, the edge rusher out of LSU, who many thought could go top 10, easily in the top 15, and he slides to them at number 20, right? There's reports that the Jaguars were looking to even trade up to get Chason, and they ended up staying put and got him at number 20. So the fact that they get 2 elite defenders with their 2 first picks in the first round, I think is huge for them. And then on day 2 with their second pick, they get Laviska Shenault from Colorado, who is a kind of a do-it-all, jack of all trades, receiver, running back. Basically, you just want to get the ball in his hands. He's the Deebo Samuel for the San Francisco 49ers. Kind of think of him in that sense. He does a little bit of everything. Maybe he's not great at one thing, but he does so many things well that I think he's going to be really, really good for Gardner Minshew. I think they're going to be a good tandem to pair, especially with DJ Clark, the other receiver on the other side. So, and then they got Davon Hamilton, a defensive tackle in the I believe the late 3rd round as well. A nice solid pick for them, a guy out of Ohio State who he's more of a clogger. He's definitely not going to replace Calais Campbell from a production standpoint, but a nice pick. And then I'm actually looking right now, and they had 1, 2, 3, 4. I believe they had like 12 picks in this round. So just a plethora of opportunities to bring in other guys that I would say are more depth players, but guys that I think will eventually contribute on a regular basis for this team. So with their top 4 picks, I really like what they did. And that's why I kind of elevated them to one of my top teams for what they did in the early rounds.
Yeah. No, I mean, they had a good draft as well. Going off my formula, they needed a corner. They drafted a corner. They needed edge rusher. They got Cleveon Chason. They needed a wide receiver. They drafted Shenault. Like what you say explains it all. I think one of the reasons I didn't have them as one of the top teams is because I thought that CeeDee Lamb and all these guys were there at number 9, and I think they could have gotten a corner with number 20. And I think, like, when you look at it, and even they could have gotten a corner at number 42 as well, their 2nd round pick. So I think they missed out on getting one of what I would call the top tier wide receivers in this draft, whereas Shenault fell to a lower tier. And I just think this team has had a problem with wide receivers, and I said this during the draft. They needed to pick one of the top guys, and there was a lot of guys. Henry Ruggs wasn't picked yet. CeeDee Lamb wasn't picked yet. None of them. There were no wide receivers that were picked yet. Looking back on it, Jerry Jeudy was still available. So that was what was disappointing to me, and that's what lowered them for me.
I think what they did is they saw the depth drop from corner, the top tier corners to the middle of the pack corners, as opposed to the top tier receivers and then the middle tier receivers. There wasn't as big of a gap. So they said, okay, let's get the best corner, and then we can come back and still get a really good receiver. Maybe he's not top flight, but the drop off from corners, I think, was a bigger deal for them. I mean, you're right. At pick 20, instead of getting Cleveon Chason, they could have gotten Justin Jefferson, right? They could have gotten Brandon Ayuk. They could have gotten T. Higgins. So you're right. They could have picked a better receiver, but Cleveon Chason's there. They needed an edge rusher, clearly, and I have zero problem with this draft. And like I said, the fact that they got Laviska Shenault. And what this says, I think this shows a lot of their trust in DJ Clark as being their true number one receiver on the outside, and having Shenault being that complimentary guy at number 2. So I think that just shows a lot in what they think in DJ Clark.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, when you look at – they were one of the teams with a lot of draft picks. They had draft capital that they could have traded up for a specific player. And I think they kind of acted like they were a playoff team that could just wait for a player to go. And say, now, they, like you guys said, they got Cleveon Chason, they got C.J. Henderson. My only knock with the early rounds is they had other receivers. They had every single receiver possible to get, and they just didn't. And they let it fall to Shenault. Yes, that's a great pick, but there was no reason why they couldn't have got a wide receiver with 9 and 20. And I thought that was their biggest need by far. So, that was just my biggest gripe. They did, though, draft almost every single piece they needed, just not in the order I would have liked. That's what my own. Yeah.
All right, that's fair.
So let's move on. I am now going to talk. Now, this is where it's going to get really interesting. We're going to go positive and then almost to negative, because Jared doesn't agree at all with this pick, with this team having a positive draft, and that is the Las Vegas Raiders.
Catch stuff.
That's the Las Vegas Raiders. I actually thought they had a pretty good draft. Now, let me get this draft up real quickly.
I can't wait to hear this, because I don't know what you're looking at.
Now, again, they didn't have that many picks. What their draft was interesting, too, because they had 2 first-round picks, 3 third-round picks, and then 2 fourth-round picks, and that's it. They drafted like I would have on Madden, right? You trade away all the stupid picks that the players are going to work out because of the Madden generator or whatever, and you just get all the high picks, right? Again, with my formula, they drafted 4 out of their 5 needs in this draft, and they drafted Henry Ruggs, which I thought was interesting, but they want to get it. They need a wide receiver. I'm not going to judge which wide receiver it was. They did stretch a little bit at corner with Damian Arnett. He was not a top corner, but he was a first round, second round corner. It wasn't like they stretched to the 3rd or 4th, right?
He was second round corner. The dude should not have been picked in the first round. I'm sorry.
Okay, well the Raiders are weird. You got John Gruden as coach. I'm just looking at it from this thing. They end up drafting an interior offensive lineman in the 4th round. I gave them credit for that as well. And they drafted a linebacker in the 3rd round, Tanner Moose, who also can play safety, a kind of hybrid player.
It's like the Clemson of the West over here, right? They've got like
Clemson
7
and Alabama
guys on this team.
Clemson and Alabama. They've drafted, I think it's like a record from one national championship team. It's ridiculous. It was the 2019 national championship game. There's like 12 players on this team there from that game. It's really weird. And then just based on the fact that every single one of their picks was in the earlier rounds, I gave them a lot of credit. Maybe my system of picking these is the reason I'm giving them credit, but they end up with 2 receivers in the first the first 3 rounds as well. Brian Edwards from South Carolina, I think an underrated wide receiver as well. So that's why they drafted all their needs, and I think that's probably why you're going to disagree with me here, because you're not necessarily high on the needs in the earlier rounds. You're more higher on the players, and so I'm very interested to see and debate you why you think the Raiders draft was actually one of your worst, because I disagree with you on completely.
Okay, so here we go. I'm looking at their draft picks overall, right? You said they had 2 first rounders, 3 third rounders, and 2 fourth rounders. What did they do with those picks? They picked 3 wide receivers, 2 corners, a safety, and a guard. right? So they basically picked a bunch of athletes, and it's so Raiders-esque, it makes me sick, right? Because when you had Al Davis, what did he like? He liked speed players. He liked guys that were super fast, guys that would, the oohs and ahs that would sell tickets. And listen, this is no disrespect to Henry Ruggs because he's a great athlete, but he's also he's a good receiver. Like, he actually runs really good routes. But it's just the Raiders would pick a guy that ran the fastest 40 time in the entire combine, which I call the underwear Olympics, right? That's just what they do. The fact that the Raiders picked Henry Ruggs over Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs' college teammate at Alabama, and over CeeDee Lamb, who I feel are two better overall receivers than Henry Ruggs, that to me, number one, is a red flag and a question mark. When you have John Gruden, who's an offensive coordinator, supposed offensive guru, and there must just be something that they like about Henry Ruggs that they, were willing to pass up with CeeDee Lamb and pass up on Jerry Jeudy with. So that's my first argument, is that I feel like they got the third best receiver and they passed up on the first and second best receiver. Secondly, Damon Arnett is a huge reach. I think at best he was a second round corner. There was no way that in my opinion, he was easily a second round. You had Gladly, you had Trayvon Diggs, there's a plethora of corners that I feel like the Raiders could have taken, and they chose to take Damon Arnett. What I'm finding and what I'm looking at with these picks here as well, it feels like the Raiders like to pick players from big time programs. Other than Lynn Bowden Jr., who played at Kentucky, when I look at their draft right here, Alabama, Ohio State, South Carolina, Clemson, right? It seems like they only like to go for guys that play in the top tier, best teams, Power 5 conferences, and they don't really like to go and shoo outside of that. You know what I mean? So, yeah. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world to do, but it's like, I feel like they've got a little bit of tunnel vision. So the fact that you get 3 wide receivers with your first 4 picks when you could have went linebacker, which I thought was a big need for them, especially middle linebacker. You could have went defensive tackle. You could have went safety. I'm a little baffled by the fact that the Raiders picked 3 wide receivers in a row. And then, okay, so here's another example. In free agency, the Raiders picked up Jeff Heath, who's formerly of the Dallas Cowboys. Yep. He's a hybrid safety. He can play some on the back end. He's better closer to the line of scrimmage, more of like a hybrid linebacker and sub packages, right? They also drafted Tanner Muse, who you mentioned, in the 3rd round, who is that same type of player. Hybrid safety, hybrid linebacker. Jeff Heath, what does he do best? Special teams. Tanner Muse, what does he do best? Special teams. You basically drafted the same player that you signed in free agency. So I understand that you need to boost your special teams, but you just drafted 2 players that literally do the same thing, right? Or I'm sorry, you drafted a player that literally does the same thing that your free agency player just does. So I don't really know what the Raiders are doing, and the fact that they didn't have a lot of picks and they didn't really diversify their picks, they stuck with the athletes, the receivers, and the corners, and didn't really get any big body guys in the interior. I think that an offense or an organization, a team starts from the inside out, right? You build with your offensive line and your defensive line and then out. Because if you can't get to the quarterback, I don't care if you're Deion Sanders, you're not going to be able to guard a guy for 5 or 6 seconds. And I don't care if you're Jerry Rice. But if your offensive line doesn't protect your quarterback in Derek Carr to throw the football, Jerry Rice isn't going to get any receptions. So like I said, I was a little baffled by not necessarily how many picks they had, but what they chose to do with those picks.
Yeah, and then you bring up a lot of interesting arguments. I think this is why we're going to disagree, because I based it a lot, this draft, based on what teams needed. And I consider Tanner Muse sort of an Isaiah Simmons-like player, but I don't want to. He's a hybrid, right? You said a hybrid. He's a safety / linebacker. He can cover like a linebacker and also play like a safety. So I gave him the kind of split credit, right? I didn't just say he's a safety like Jeff Heath. I think he's more of a linebacker as well. I think Clemson breeds those type of players, right? And they actually have Lynn Bowden Jr. listed as a running back after the draft. Even though he played quarterback and wide receiver at Kentucky, for some reason he's listed as a running back. So they didn't technically draft 3 wide receivers with their first pick. They considered they only did 2. So I went like that. I don't really dock them for Henry Ruggs. I thought Henry Ruggs' outfit was a little ridiculous that he wore during the draft, and that might throw up some red flags. But this is
Hey,
the Las Vegas Raiders, Jared. This is the Las Vegas Raiders, and I didn't give them a doc for Damian Arnett. They obviously see something. There's plenty of players that we could go. Oh, that guy was drafted too. I personally think Trayvon Diggs. I don't know how the hell he dropped to you guys with the Cowboys in the second round pick. I thought he was one of the best corners in the draft. So I'm not right on every single pick. So they picked all of their needs with their first 4 picks. The only thing they were missing was defensive linemen. But I think that's something maybe you could pick up in free agency as well. And so it's not the biggest deal. You have one. It wasn't their top need. It was one of their top needs. So yeah, I think no, for sure. And the Raiders are interesting. And again, if I docked them for Arnett and all these other guys, they still would have been my top team. And let me just tell you guys this. This wasn't my top. Like, the Vikings were by far my top draft. The Raiders were like my 5th, 6th. And just the fact that Jared disagrees completely, that's why we're talking about it. I have 4 teams that are ahead of them in this draft as well. I just thought they were an underrated draft. Jared thought they were an extremely overrated draft. So very, very interesting there. For that. All right, so are we moving completely to negatives now, right? We're moving to the negatives.
We're on the negative train right now.
Okay, so Jared, why don't you give me your negative team? And I know you're going to love this too. Philadelphia Eagles. Philadelphia Eagles.
It is the Eagles, and it's mainly with their first 2 picks. They ended up having, I believe, 10 or so picks in the draft, and they filled a lot of depth needs. But their first 2 picks are head scratchers to me. Their first overall pick at number 21, they take Jalen Reagor, the receiver out of TCU, an explosive player, a great player, and arguably a first-round pick, in my opinion. Here's the problem. You had Justin Jefferson out of LSU, won a national championship, right? One of the kind of hottest and fastest rising receivers in the entire draft. You have Brandon Ayuk out of Arizona State, who's, I believe, a similar player to Jalen Reagor. And you had T. Higgins, right? There are so many other receivers. You had Michael Pittman Jr. out of USC. There was so many other receivers who I felt were better than Jalen Reagor overall. And yet, for some reason, the Eagles kind of just jumped all those guys, just like the Raiders jumped the top 2 receivers in the draft and picked Henry Ruggs. The Eagles kind of leapfrog some of the other receivers and pick Jalen Reagor. So they must just see something in Reagor that maybe some others didn't, or that they were willing to work with. The one thing I will say is that I hope that his durability is like A+ top notch, because that was the Eagles' biggest problem last year, is they were playing with 4th and 5th string receivers, and Carson Wentz didn't have anyone to throw to other than Ertz at the tight end spot. So the receiver, not that they needed receiver, but it was the actual receiver that I was a little skeptical with. And then we get to round 2, and it was probably one of the biggest moments, biggest surprises of the entire draft, when the Philadelphia Eagles draft Jalen Hurts, the quarterback out of Oklahoma. And everyone's going like, whoa, what the heck? Like, at first, I thought the Jordan Love to the Packers was the biggest quarterback moment of the draft. And then we have Jalen Hurts going here. Now, here's the thing. Carson Wentz, if you look at, since he's been in the league and the Eagles have made the playoffs 3 times, Carson Wentz, I believe, has a total of like 6 passes thrown in those playoff games. So obviously his durability is a big issue, and the Eagles needed a backup quarterback to be able to have someone reliable. The problem is, I'm just not so sure that Jalen Hurts is the guy for this Eagles team. Now, if you're looking for the Eagles to become the New Orleans Saints and have Jalen Hurts be the Taysom Hill of that team, where he kind of lines up in the slot and lines up all over the place. No. Yeah, Jalen Hurts has the body to do it, but he's a quarterback that likes to run, right? He's not some project that let's put him at the running back spot. Let's put him at tight end. He's not going to play special teams. So the fact that they took such a high draft pick, right, with number 2, that's a second round draft pick is expected to play and play a lot and contribute a lot. Jalen Hurts is going to be holding a clipboard most of the game for the Eagles unless Carson Wentz gets injured. So I'm just not sold that Jalen Hurts will be able to contribute to this Eagles team with such a high draft pick, right? When we look back in 3 or 4 years, I'm not saying Jalen Hurts is going to be a bust, but I don't think that he's going to be a boom player because of where he was picked and because of the team that he went to. If he went to another team where their quarterback was aging, he's in his late 30s, and in a year or two, Jalen Hurts can take over as the starter, I think that would have been a lot more feasible. Carson Wentz is 27, just signed over a $100 million contract, right? The Eagles have invested a lot in him, and they plan on him being the quarterback of the future. So why are you going to spend a second-round draft pick on a quarterback that's going to sit there and hold a clipboard and write down plays? It just didn't make sense to me. But as a Cowboys fan, hey, I'm all about it, right? Because that's just one more player, one more player that the Cowboys really don't have to worry about. So.
Yeah. The Eagles draft was interesting. The Jalen Hurts pick is an absolute waste of a pick. I completely agree with you. I actually thought they had a pretty solid draft, and then that docked them so many points with me. They ended up being in the more negative draft because you waste the 53rd pick in the draft on a position that you've spent over $100 million, obviously, right? On what are you doing? Jalen Hurts, and you're right, he's not Taysom Hill, he's slow. There's a reason Jalen Hurts was not a highly rated quarterback in this draft is because he's kind of one-dimensional. He's not really a great passer. He's more of a runner, but he's not as fast as Lamar Jackson, and he's obviously not as great of a thrower as a Patrick Mahomes. So what is he, right? He's more of a hybrid quarterback, but those guys don't work in this league. So yeah, maybe Doug Peterson sees something specific that he did at Alabama that he can now do. But I didn't see that. They didn't make much sense. I didn't really give them too much flack for the Jalen Reagor pick. They needed a receiver, so they just picked the wide receiver. Yeah, they should have drafted Justin Jefferson and Brandon Ayuk. Those two went after him, but still drafted wide receiver, so whatever. But yeah, I mean that Jalen Hurts pick doesn't make much sense. How do you think Carson Wentz is feeling about that too?
If I'm Carson Wentz, I'm not really sweating it because, I really don't think that Jalen Hurts is competition for Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz is clearly the better quarterback, right? He's also been in this system for years. So Carson Wentz's only problem is his durability. If he can stay healthy, it's not really a competition to me. And that's the other thing as well is, I've heard from other podcasts and other reporters say, well, the Eagles plan on using Jalen Hurts in some capacity on the field with Carson Wentz, right? Well, I'm like, okay. So what do you want Jalen Hurts to do? Because if Jalen Hurts is your number 2 quarterback, but yet he's not going to be in that Taysom Hill role, what are you doing? Because you're going to risk Jalen Hurts getting injured and then risk losing your number 2 quarterback when your number 1, your starting quarterback, already has durability issues. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, I don't know. I feel a little bad for Jalen Hurts, right? I think that not that he shouldn't have been a second-round pick. I think he definitely deserved to be a second-round pick. But I think it was just the wrong team that he ended up going to. And almost, I don't know. I think it's a situation where it was different circumstances with Josh Rosen, the quarterback that was drafted with Arizona. Yeah. And then he ended up going to Miami, and Miami just picked up Tua Tagovailoa. But for Jalen Hurts, it's I think you can see him with the Eagles for a couple years, and then the Eagles saying, okay, this isn't really working out, or maybe this isn't what we thought was going to happen. And Jalen Hurts ends up getting traded, and he goes from kind of team to team until he can find his niche. I wish he was drafted to Pittsburgh and he can back up Ben Roethlisberger for a year or two, or maybe the Colts, right? Because the Colts have Phillip Rivers, but that's really just a 1-year rental. Just a better situation for Jalen Hurts. I think this is a bad situation for him.
Yeah, I mean, I actually disagree. I don't think Jalen Hurts was a second-round quarterback. I think I don't know what you do with him. He's the type of hybrid that you don't want. And the fact is this, too. The Eagles have had 2 quarterbacks on their roster, Nate Sudfeld and Kyle Lauletta. Now, Sudfeld's been on that roster for a while. He probably knows the playbook just as well as Carson Wentz does. And Lauletta was on the team last year. They already had potential backup quarterbacks for this team. So I really don't understand why they needed Jalen Hurts. With a second-round pick. If they would have picked Jalen Hurts with a 4th or 5th, that's fine. You're going to try to figure something out. And they had a pretty solid draft after that pick as well. But it's just with a second-round pick, that's just horrible of a pick. I didn't like it at all. I have to agree.
And the best part about all of this was seeing the Eagles fans' reactions, all their videos. One Eagles fan literally turning red like a tomato, about to go ballistic.
Yep.
It was great. It was a sight to see, right? I don't like people being under distress, but if you're an Eagles fan, it's just as a Cowboys fan, you can't help but smile at the fact that they were upset about that pick. I don't know many. I do know a couple Eagles fans. None of them were happy with this pick, right? I really only think the people within the Eagles organization feel great about the Jalen Hurts pick, and it's going to have to pay off, or they're going to get scolded. And you know that the Eagles fans will do just that. They do not hold back. They booed Santa Claus. They will easily boo every single person in that front office, including the owner, if this doesn't work.
I believe the Eagles fans, too, were the one fans that got away with booing Roger Goodell somehow through the Zoom call, too. I think the Eagles were the one team that still booed him, and it got through. Like, it got through the ESPN broadcast. And instead of, like, cheering like they all were, the Eagles fans were booing, and then all this happens. It's just hilarious. It's hilarious. I'm not a big Eagles fan either, and I don't know any Eagles fans, as far as I know. Let me know if you're one of my friends and you're an Eagles fan, and I'll make fun of you to your face. But you know, I love it too, Jared, because I don't care about any of those NFC East teams, and to see this team continually with their fans just get shafted with this pick, it wasn't very good. Speaking of bad quarterback picks, potentially, the last team that we're going to go over today is the Green Bay Packers. They were one of my worst drafts in this draft. They were actually tied with another team with the worst draft based on my statistics. And I'll explain why. Their biggest need going into this was potentially wide receiver or tight end. They did pick a tight end in the third round. Did they pick a wide receiver in this draft? Nope, they didn't. Doesn't make sense why they didn't do at least one wide receiver with either your third round pick, your second round pick, your fifth round pick, and all your other picks in the draft. To get 0 guys doesn't make any sense for me. And then the biggest thing I'm going to harp on is the fact that they drafted their first 2 picks with guys they already had. They have Aaron Rodgers. I get it. Jordan Love, can't miss prospect, but he's definitely a project, right? So you pick him, you waste your number 26 pick when there's a lot of needs you could have had. There was wide receivers. You could have traded up for Brandon Ayuk, right? You could have traded up for something. And then the worst one by far is their second round pick, A.J. Dillon from Boston College, running back. They already have Aaron Jones, right? Like, who's one of the best running backs last year. So that didn't make any sense to me at all. And then they went from, like, they didn't have a 4th round pick, so they had to go wait till the 5th round. They just, overall, based on what picks they had in this draft and how they picked them, I thought the Packers had one of the worst, the actually second worst draft out of this entire thing. And maybe you could even argue they had the worst draft just because they needed a wide receiver and they didn't draft a single one, Jared, a single one. And they drafted a running back when you have one of the top 10 running backs in the league. What are they doing?
Yeah. I'm going to give them credit for the Love pick. And listen, this is what the Packers do back in 2005 when the Packers had Brett Favre, their franchise quarterback, future Hall of Famer, now Hall of Famer. What did they do? In the late first round, they drafted Aaron Rodgers out of Cal, right? And everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, how's this dynamic going to work? Is Brett Favre gonna tutor Aaron Rodgers? Is Aaron Rodgers going to be the successor for their potential Hall of Famer? What was going to happen?" Obviously, we know that Aaron Rodgers had led the Packers to the Super Bowl, and he's a Super Bowl champion now, right? It's kind of, we're back in that same bowl. Aaron Rodgers is in his mid-30s, right? He's I would say, in his late prime, but he's getting out of his prime. And within the next few years, right, if Jordan Love pans out, he could obviously be the one to take over the reins. And Brett Favre came out yesterday in the interview on the Rich Eisen show, I believe, and said that he thinks Aaron Rodgers will end his career with another team. He doesn't think that Aaron Rodgers will finish his career with the Packers. And obviously a guy who left the Packers to go play for Minnesota, their rival, he knows a little something about that. So I thought that was pretty interesting that Brett Favre came out and said that. So I'm okay with that pick, thinking for the future. I don't think that was necessarily a wasted pick, but the rest of their draft, I completely agree with you. A.J. Dillon, I don't know what you're doing. You have Aaron Jones, who I believe he had 4 touchdowns against my Dallas Cowboys last year alone, right? Aaron Jones is a stud. Not that many people know about him. He's not Ezekiel Elliott. He's not Saquon Barkley, but he's a very capable running back who can be on the field for all 3 downs, doesn't need to come off the field. So the fact that you take a second-round pick and get A.J. Dillon, I'm a little shocked by. And you're right. Here's the biggest kicker of all this, right? The Packers, since Aaron Rodgers has been a starter in the NFL, have never drafted a wide receiver in the top 2 rounds for Aaron Rodgers. What does Mike McCarthy do now that he's a head coach for the Cowboys? They draft CeeDee Lamb with their first overall pick, number 16, right? And it was only last year was the first year that Mike McCarthy was not Aaron Rodgers' head coach. So literally Aaron Rodgers has to be sitting there with his hands just on his head, like, what do I have to do to get talent around me other than Aaron Jones and Devontae Adams, right? I get it. Those are 2 great players, but you also lose Jimmy Graham, who didn't necessarily pan out with the Packers. But it's like you need a weapon opposite Devontae Adams. You need a tight end. They drafted one in the 3rd round, but tight end was arguably the worst overall position in the entire draft this year. So it's not like you were getting a stud tight end who can come in and immediately contribute.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the Packers were doing here in this sense. And I agree, they definitely had one of the worst drafts overall, other than the Jordan Love pick. If you're Aaron Rodgers, I think they burned a bridge, and I would not be surprised that if in 2 years Aaron Rodgers is gone. They put up a stat sheet where it would be very difficult for the Packers to either release or trade Aaron Rodgers because he will count. I believe this year and next year he's going to count like $50 million towards their cap, and that's just a lot of money to move, and no other team's going to want to take on that salary. But in 3 years, I believe in 2022 or the 2023 season, that cap number comes significantly down, and it'd be a lot easier to trade him or just outright release him. So, if Jordan Love sits for 2 years, learns under Aaron Rodgers, learns the offense, gets a little better technique-wise, I easily see Jordan Love coming in and being the future of the Packers franchise.
Yeah, I didn't really have a problem with the Love pick, and especially when you look at Brandon Ayuk getting drafted literally the pick before, you maybe thought that they were like, okay, if Ayuk's on the board, we're going to draft him. If not, it's Love. Maybe that's the way their thinking was.
Listen, T. Higgins was still on the board.
Okay, yeah. Wait. So let me explain it. So I'm going to do the whole diatribe.
Junior was still on the board.
You're doing it for me. So yeah, they had T. Higgins they could have drafted, Michael Pittman Jr. Let me go down the list. Laviska Shenault Jr., KJ Hamler, Chase Claypool, who's a wide receiver tight end mix.
Hybrid.
He's 6'4", 240. They could, and here's by the way, again, 2nd round pick. They could have picked one of these guys too. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, Jared. I just hated this pick. I mean, let's see who else they could have drafted. Van Jefferson, Denzel Mims. Denzel Mims.
Denzel Mims was still there?
He was still there. He was drafted 59. I mean, I'm talking about the 1st round.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
but
even the 2nd round, Denzel Mims is there at 59. That's 3 picks before the Packers. If you're the Packers, why not trade one of your?
That's exactly. They had 3 6th round picks, 2 7, 1 5, 1 3. I mean, they used their 3 on a tight end, but like this was a draft where you're right. The tight end wasn't a big position. There wasn't really any tight ends. Probably Chase Claypool, who's a hybrid, probably was the top one, right? If you look at it. So then, you look at it, it's wide receiver was their biggest need just because of the fact that tight end wasn't available. And they went through that whole list and didn't do it. So they had 2 rounds to do it and they didn't do it. It's just stupid. It's bad. It's just bad. And then, by the way, the rest of the draft, let me explain this based on my formula. So not only did they not draft a wide receiver, they also needed, let me get back to the Packers really quickly. It's so low on my list, I had to zoom down. They also didn't draft an offensive lineman, a linebacker, or a corner until the 6th round as well. And they needed all those picks as well, too. So they really I think they drafted John Runyon Jr. in the 6th round. I think they thought they were getting the actual John Runyon, the old John Runyon with that pick. I think they made a mistake. Matt LaFleur, man.
I can't defend anything. I can't defend the Packers right now. I'm literally looking at their draft selections, and It's bad. Yeah, I'm watching Game of Thrones right now. I just got hooked on it. This whole quarantine lockdown has got me finally on Game of Thrones, and all I want to do right now is just like shame,
Yeah,
shame
shame. Shame.
on And if you've seen Game of Thrones and Cersei Lannister, you obviously know what I'm talking about. But that's how I feel with this Packers organization right now. Is other than their first round pick, they deserve to walk down right next to the stadium and have fans just yelling shame to them, because this pick or these draft picks are just not good.
Yeah, imagine me.
Here's the thing, right? They went 13-3 last year, so they're not a bad team, right? They have good players on their team, but you would expect to build off of that. And if anything, I think this team has just regressed. I'm not sure that any of the players, including Jordan Love, obviously, are going to come in and immediately contribute to this team in a positive way right now. I think they're all development players.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and you just look at the fact that T. Higgins was still there. No. It was just, and you've got pick number 33, but that literally, I think actually a lot of us had T. Higgins. I think I had T. Higgins literally going to the Packers. T. Higgins
going there. Now T. Higgins is a little more like Devontae Adams in their play style, right? Maybe Devontae Adams is a little bit quicker, but they're more but Denzel Mims, when he's there, I mean, oh, come on. In round 2, Denzel Mims, and you go A.J. Dillon, running back out of Boston College. It's just...
Yeah. And again, because you didn't really need it, you could have got another quarterback potentially like later in the draft. I don't know. It just, that whole draft didn't make much sense for me. And that's why I had them as one of my, if not worst drafts in this draft.
Yeah, no, trust me. If I'm Aaron Rodgers, I'm fuming right now. I'm fuming. Yeah. I'm not talking to the organization. I wouldn't talk to them until I had to see them in person. They send me a text. I'm not even messing with them right now. I'm sitting back in my mansion. I'm still, preparing, getting ready for the season, but I think they seriously burned a bridge, and I do not think that Aaron Rodgers will finish his career as a Green Bay Packer.
Yeah, I mean, at least the Patriots tried to get Tom Brady a receiver last year, right? Just didn't work out, right? They tried to get Tom Brady, N'Keal Harry, and I think if that would have worked, I think he would have stayed.
N'Keal Harry, he was dealing with an injury for most of the year. It's not like he played all 16 games and he just underperformed. I think he just dealt with an injury and he was just immediately behind the 8 ball. So if he would have stayed healthy, who knows? Maybe the Patriots season ends a little differently. So I'm not going to somewhat of a comparison, but a little differently. The Packers, they just don't want to give Aaron Rodgers any help whatsoever.
Yeah, and to that point too, where we're talking about if Tom Brady can lead the Patriots, Aaron Rodgers can lead the Packers.
No doubt.
I mean, we've now seen everything possible here in the
NFL.
Doubt. So, Jared, really quickly, we have a little less than 10 minutes left. Just give me, I know you had a couple more teams. Who were those other teams that you thought had good and bad drafts on your list?
Well, since we're just on this negative train right now, I'm going to stick to it for a minute, and I'm going to go with the Rams. Mm-hmm. And the Rams... listen, first of all, they are in like cap hell right now. As in they traded for Jalen Ramsey, right? But they don't clearly have the money to pay Jalen Ramsey right now. And you want to know why they don't have the money to pay Jalen Ramsey? It's because 2 players that are currently not even on their team right now, in Todd Gurley, who they shockingly released, and in Clay Matthews, both of those players are still looking for paychecks from the Rams. Right? They're about to both file grievances against the Rams because they have not been paid in full from last season yet. Yeah. So the Rams are in a world of hurt. I don't even know how they're going to be able to pay their draft picks, let alone their former players who are now on other teams. But here's the thing. The Rams don't have a first-round pick, obviously, because they traded for Jalen Ramsey. They also will not have a first-round pick in next year's draft. So already putting themselves behind the 8 ball, Jalen Ramsey is going to have to be a legit superstar and continue to be that for this Rams team. So what do the Rams do with their first pick in the NFL draft, which is actually the 2nd round? They take Cam Akers, the running back out of Florida State, who is a legit running back. He was one of the top-ranked players coming out of high school. So the boy can ball. He can play. Here's the thing, though. Last year in the 2nd round, the Rams drafted Darrell Henderson, right, who backed up Todd Gurley and was a very good running back. So now all of a sudden you've got Todd Henderson and Cam Akers, who are, to me, kind of the same player. Like I don't really understand that when I think the Rams could have easily gone offensive line. They could have gone secondary opposite Jalen Ramsey. They could have gone safety because Eric Weddle is no longer there. They could have gone linebacker because Corey Littleton is no longer there. I mean, there's so many other needs on this team. They traded away Brandon Cooks, so you could have gotten a receiver there to be your third receiver behind Robert Woods.
Well, they did, Jared. They did draft Van Jefferson with the 5 picks.
Okay, you're right. So, okay, I'll retract that statement. But then they in the third round they draft Terrell Lewis, the outside linebacker out of Alabama, who, when healthy, is a good player. Keywords, when healthy, because every year at Alabama the dude has had serious injuries, and I don't believe that he's played a full season in college, right? So you're taking a flyer in the third round on a player that may or may not be available, and your third round players at best need to be like depth guys that contribute on special teams, if not depth, for defensive purposes. They take Terrell Burgess, a safety out of Utah, in the third round, who, in my opinion, wasn't even Utah's best safety. Mm-hmm. I think they took that team's second best safety, so they passed on them. They took a tight end in the fourth round in Bryce Hopkins when they already have 2 tight ends, and Jason Everett and Tyler Higbee. So now you take a third tight end when, once again, you're going away from a need in offensive line, linebacker, safety. I'm kind of baffled by what the Rams are doing. Almost like with the Packers, it's like you're not really drafting for need, and you lose premier players. You cut premier players in the offseason, and you don't necessarily replace that. So
yeah.
Just not really sure what the Rams are doing here. Just not really a good way to enter into a new stadium.
I'll get you if that stadium is even built on time. If I'm just saying. You look at this too. I think the biggest mistake they made here. You're right. They drafted Cam Akers, and I actually forgot they drafted Dale Henderson. So I just lowered their score on my draft board right now because I just that's a bad pick. They had AJ Epinesa, that was picked 2 picks later. The edge rusher from Iowa that they could have picked. They needed an edge rusher because obviously Dante Fowler didn't work out and all that stuff. And they could have had him. And even the Eagles stupidly drafted Jalen Hurts right after. That's 2 horrible picks in a row, by the way. And then they also had Denzel Mims on the board for the second wide receiver they could have picked too, over Van Jefferson. Yeah. Like it's very, very, very interesting. But,
yeah, no, if you're a Rams fan right now,
I'm happy.
It's not looking pretty.
Yeah, I love it.
I mean, you go from like Super Bowl to doghouse real quick, right? Penthouse to like mini studio is what the Rams are right now, right? They were like this. They're like literally, it seems like so long ago. Like it was just 2 years ago. They were the sexy team. They had Jared Goff, the #1 overall pick. Todd Gurley. You've got the youngest coach in the NFL, and Sean McVay, who's this crazy innovator, right? And they go to the Super Bowl, and then really ever since that loss, they haven't been able to recover. And now all of a sudden, it's like, whoa, what is this team doing? They've got money troubles. They're in cap trouble. They can't pay their former players. They don't have a first-round pick for the next 2 years. And then when they do have picks, they're not really drafting for need. Which kind of goes against my thing. But it's like in this situation, they have to draft for need, and they draft players that they kind of already have at that specific position. So just baffled by what the Rams did.
Yeah, Jared, like you are with the Eagles, I had no problem with them drafting like this because that just means the Cardinals have a better chance to get in third place in this division.
Yeah.
And the NFC West. And a lot of people, by the way, too, are high on the Cardinals. And that's how I wanted to end the draft review really quickly. I couldn't leave out the Cardinals out of this draft. And I'm not wrong. I mean, they're getting A+ across the board for this draft. I think it's just self-explanatory. I don't need to sit here and sound biased, but if you don't know what the Cardinals did,
it's okay.
Yeah, they obviously get Isaiah Simmons, like we mentioned. They shouldn't have got him. The Panthers could have drafted him earlier. The Giants potentially could have drafted him. They get Isaiah Simmons, and then somehow Josh Jones, left tackle that some of us had in the first and second rounds. Yeah, number 72 too, like the 8th pick. So they also drafted 2 interior linemen with their 4th round picks. They get the nation's leading tackler, Evan Weaver from Cal, who's a linebacker, middle linebacker, with their 6th pick. And they also draft a fairly high-rated running back, Eno Benjamin, from Arizona State, with their 7th round pick. So they also filled every single one of their needs in this draft as well. They just need an edge rusher, and they weren't able to properly getting up picks.
So they didn't feel all of their.
Well, no, but Isaiah Simmons can do everything. It's like that guy can potentially be an edge rusher if they want, right, on some plays. So in some ways, Isaiah Simmons fills so many needs that they did technically kind of fill most of their needs.
It's funny. I'm looking at the Cardinals depth chart right now, and they've got Isaiah Simmons as their will linebacker, which is one of their middle linebackers or outside linebackers. And then they've also got him as strong safety. Like, he's at 2 different positions already.
I love that. Yeah, and the thing with the Cardinals too is they were the worst, I think, team of all time covering tight ends last year. And Isaiah Simmons, you know what he did the most at Clemson? He covered the slot and he covered tight ends. So that's a big pickup for the Cardinals right there. Obviously, they need offensive line help. And with their first 2 picks, they filled in their needs that weren't met in free agency. And that's why a lot of people are giving them A+, and they also just drafted well later in the rounds. Cowboys did as well, Jared. If you want to give the Cowboys a shout out, they drafted really well too.
No, they did. I mean, listen, when CeeDee Lamb falls to you at 16, I was like, oh my gosh, like, this isn't happening right now, right? I really thought CeeDee Lamb could have been drafted first, been the first receiver drafted. Obviously, Henry Ruggs went to the Raiders, and I was, shocked, but really not. And then you have Jerry Jeudy going at pick 15 to the Denver Broncos. So our buddy Alex Silva was very, very happy about that. And the fact that the Falcons at 16, I mean, they had, they don't need a receiver. They have Julio Jones. They have Calvin Ridley. So I knew they weren't going to. But the fact that CeeDee Lamb fell to the Cowboys at 16 just made their draft right there. Like, after that, I'm like, I really don't care what the Cowboys do because they just got CeeDee Lamb, arguably the best receiver in the draft. They did, however, but they kind of fixed some holes in their secondary. They got Trayvon Diggs, the cornerback out of Alabama in round 2, who some thought could have been a late first round pick, more thought an early second round. They also got, this is kind of my sleeper pick for the Cowboys, Reggie Robinson II, the cornerback out of Tulsa, who because he played at Tulsa, he wasn't getting the probably the looks that he would have gotten if he would have played at an Alabama or an Ohio State. But he's a good slot receiver. He can play on the outside. He's long and lengthy. He needs to get better technique-wise. But one thing that he does great, he's great at special teams. He can return punts and kicks. Also, he had 4 blocked kicks in college. Every year he played on special teams, on the punt team, he blocked a kick. So the guy is going to be an immediate special teams ace for this team. And yeah, I like what the Cowboys did. Not the best draft, but I definitely would give them like an A- or a very high B+ for their draft.
Yeah, I was very high on the Cowboys too. I love that Bradley Anae pick later, and Tyler Badez, I believe that's how you say his name.
Yeah,
from Wisconsin. Yeah, they drafted well. And Trayvon Diggs obviously dropping them. I don't know how the hell that happened either. Like the CeeDee Lamb Trayvon Diggs thing, that normally doesn't happen to the Cowboys. Like normally they kind of just draft how they're supposed to, and they got lucky. I mean they got lucky, but so did the Cardinals. So I'm not gonna talk trash over here. You know what I'm saying? Okay. I don't know how we got Josh Jones, but I'm excited. With that excitement, we're going to end the podcast today. Next week, we will definitely be jumping into the rest of sports. You have the NBA potentially opening its practices facilities around the United States and Canada, obviously. And then also you have UFC events coming up. You have golf tournaments. We're going to talk about the state of Florida as well. And any other news coming out about this coronavirus, because we need to kind of get back into that and educate you guys if you don't know what's been going on in the world of the rest of sports while we've been kind of in a trance about the NFL draft the last month or so. So we're going to get back to kind of normalcy with the next podcast. But yeah, with that, I'm Nick Nenad.
I'm Jared Smith.
And this has been the Cover 2 podcast. See you guys.